Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for this part one of a two-part series. Is low carbon hydrogen the panacea for climate change? What can the US learn from early adoption in Europe? This series is being hosted by the US Energy Association's Consensus Program in partnership with London Economics International. My name is Alex Krauka, and I'm a Seattle-based consultant for USCA working on the Consensus Program. For those who don't know, the Consensus Program, established in 2008, seeks to build both domestic and international consensus on carbon capture, use, and storage, and carbon management technologies such as blue hydrogen. We build this consensus with the public, policymakers, industry, and other stakeholders who may be interested. We do this through a series of briefings and webinars such as today's, workshops, reports and white papers, and we put out a monthly news clips email as well. If you are not on this email list, please feel free to subscribe by emailing my colleague Michelle Littlefield at mlittlefield@usca.org. A few quick logistical notes. We will be taking questions today. However, due to time constraints, we will wait until the end to answer them. If you do have questions or comments, please enter them into the Q&A box as seen in the slide here. And we will do our best to answer as many as possible in the time that we have today. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording and copies of the presentation will be posted on our event page located at usca.org/events. It's now my pleasure to introduce today's moderator, Julia Frayer. Julia is a managing director at London Economics International LLC, a global economic firm that combines detailed understanding of specific network and commodity industries with data-driven, objective, and rigorous analysis to help clients navigate the intricacies of energy and infrastructure markets around the world. Julia has more than 20 years of experience providing expert insights and consulting services in the power sector and other infrastructure industries, including gas pipelines and distribution. She has worked extensively in the US, Canada, Europe, and Asia on a range of issues in the electricity sector, including investment and commercial strategy, resource planning, and market design. Julia is based out of Boston and co-leads LEI's clean energy and energy transition practice, advising stakeholders and policymakers on policy options to achieve decarbonization goals and cost effectively and reliably transition toward a sustainable clean energy future. With that, I'll let Julia introduce our panelists to give us the lessons learned from initial experiences with low carbon hydrogen in Europe. It's all yours, Julia.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon to wherever you may all be around the world today. For today's discussion, I'm joined by a panel of experts and longtime collaborators from the other side of the pond. My company, London Economics International and Frontier Economics, have worked together on a number of regulatory policy and market design projects across the globe. Frontier Economics is an economic consultancy based in Europe with expertise in energy, transportation, technology, healthcare, and communications. And over the last 5 years, Frontier's experts have been working with the UK government, the European Union, and private stakeholders on various hydrogen-specific issues, ranging from designing support schemes for hydrogen development in the UK to evaluating barriers for entry on hydrogen importation into the EU. It is with great pleasure that I welcome today Dan Roberts, Claire Thornhill, and Catherine Galama from Frontier Economics. Just before I get them started, I thought it would be worthwhile to introduce each of our three panelists. Catherine is an associate director in Frontier's energy practice with significant experience advising on network regulation and wider policy intervention in the context of low carbon transition. Claire is also an associate director at Frontier in the energy practice, and her recent work has focused on application of different business models and policies in the low carbon energy sector. Finally, today we will also hear from Dan Roberts, a director in Frontier's energy practice. He has worked extensively with governments and private sector investors on various policy-oriented and commercial issues related to low-carbon hydrogen infrastructure. So with that short introduction, I would like to open it up to our wonderful group of experts to take us through some important lessons learned from early adoption in the EU of hydrogen policies. I believe we will hear first from Catherine.
Yes, thank you very much, Julia. It's a pleasure to be here today. I think a short presentation is now on screen, and I will get going with presenting it. So we intend here today to give a bit of an overview of the thinking and a little bit of the decision making that has been going on in Europe in relation to low carbon hydrogen. We thought we would give an overview in 3 areas. We will start by giving an overview of those production and use scenarios that are being envisaged in Europe. As you will see the conditional is required in terms of setting the scene here, but we will aim to give you some visibility. Second, Claire will give an illustration of how European governments and administration are thinking of getting the hydrogen market up and running, the clean hydrogen market up and running, what is being proposed, why it's being considered, and where we see decisions being made. And finally, Dan will go on to discuss implications of all this specifically for the infrastructure developments across Europe before we end with a few concluding remarks. So starting with production and use scenarios in Europe, after a very assertive title around how there may be lessons to be learned from Europe, we might now dive into the uncertainty that is actually still in the news in this area in Europe. So what we mean by this is that Europe is currently, as a number of places in the world, working on its path to 2050, ideally net zero economy. And there is currently some uncertainty around the scale as well as the breadth of hydrogen usage at the 2050 horizon, where the majority of countries are starting from a similar place with some industrial clusters using hydrogen, some possibly low-hanging fruit using hydrogen in transport in the short term, as well as a consideration that blending hydrogen into natural gas infrastructure and therefore just using it where natural gas is currently being used might be also a good option to further explore what low carbon hydrogen may have to offer. But the role that it would play at the 2050 horizon still is quite uncertain, with some scenarios suggesting that it might continue to be used in a limited fashion in some clusters across Europe, but other scenarios seeing some dedicated hydrogen grids in some regions, assuming that maybe there will be a wider conversion of uses, but located in specific regions. And finally, other scenarios envisaging quite large scale use across several sectors. So we will go into a bit more detail about what different governments and administrations have said around this, and then explore where this uncertainty is coming from, both in terms of the demand, where we see it possibly arising, possibly not, as well as the production potential that is underpinning all of this. So in terms of those decisions that maybe have been made, we're setting the scene from a policy perspective at the European level first, and by this I mean European Commission level. A strategy on hydrogen was published in July 2020, and this reflects the high vision from the European Commission at that point, which mainly is effectively a vision in 3 phases. a phase in which we currently are now, which is an exploratory phase, looking to develop production capacity, in particular with a target of 6 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers installed, and this is supporting a further exploration of technology as well as potential use cases. The Commission then foresees a second phase with significant scale up towards 40 gigawatts of renewable hydrogen electrolyzers installed, and as we'll go on to discuss, this is a phase where a significant scope for intervention is foreseen in order to support this scale up. And then a third phase, loosely defined as 2030 onwards, would be the large scale deployment with no specific sort of target provided yet. The expectation that we would be relying on hydrogen to reach a number of hard to decarbonize sectors, and we'll go on to discuss what that might mean. Maybe worth flagging hot off the press that there were announcements yesterday from the European Commission in relation to its Fit for 55 package, and these announcements include a renewed commitment to hydrogen via a number of provisions, for instance, an exemption, well, in fact, an award of free carbon credits under the European Trading Scheme system for electrolyzers, some targets for refueling stations in transport, and further expectations are placed on the European Commission for legislative announcements towards the back end of this year as part of a wider gas decarbonization package, which should include a number of provisions further pushing the rollout of hydrogen and pushing for certification as well in order to enable the market. Now, this announcement obviously is at European level. We also have some national strategies sort of popping up everywhere in Europe. We thought we'd give you a few examples to start with Germany. Germany is clearly seen as the front runner in relation to green hydrogen development at the moment in Europe. They're actively promoting this with some projects already out of the ground, others being worked on, and actually quite significant capacity planned by the 2025 horizon. The hydrogen strategy illustrates in a way how national strategies are panning out, with a ramp-up phase typically in the coming years, and then further scaling up expected at the 2030 horizon, with intervention across a number of areas. Germany at the moment is planning to invest about 9 billion euros in hydrogen, with a significant share of that aimed at supporting directly the development of electrolyzer capacity by 2030. But also, interestingly, in targeting the development of partnerships with other countries, because Germany is one of those countries in Europe who see hydrogen, the hydrogen market as relying significantly on imports, given the scale of potential demand. Another example we thought we would provide is that of the UK, where a number of scenarios are being considered, as illustrated on the next slides. I think I see a little clock suggesting there may be a bit of a lag with the slides. Here we are, thank you.
Apologies, my internet connection has gone a bit unstable, but yeah, let's keep going for now.
Thank you. So another example here from the UK, less at the policy level, but more at the planning level, where we have illustrated here two of the scenarios envisaged by the National Energy Transport Infrastructure Operator, where at the top you see a scenario that envisages largely sort of electrification as a solution for home heating, transport, and a large part of industry, but some production of hydrogen through electrolysis. And then alternatively, you see the system transformation scenario at the bottom, where you've got very widespread use of hydrogen for industry, heavy duty vehicles, as well as home heating in places. In those scenarios in the UK, hydrogen is actually mainly produced through methane reforming, with large requirement for natural gas with the carbon capture utilization and storage, which is, I think, an interesting situation to contrast with what we were seeing about Germany just before, where you will have seen that policy was very much targeted at supporting the deployment of electrolyzer capacity. And already you see here some differences panning out. I think we have an internet breakdown on the part of Claire, who's presenting the slides. So I'm going to see if I can take over. Oh, here we go. Okay. There we go. Can you view the slides this way?
Yes.
Does that work? Okay, let's do that then. Okay, let me flick through to where we were. So why the uncertainty? Well, on one level, the uncertainty comes from still some ongoing thinking and exploration going on with the uses that hydrogen may serve. If we start with industry, where obviously hydrogen is mostly used today in the form of what we call grey hydrogen as feedstock to a number of processes, the thinking in Europe is currently focusing on obviously replacing grey hydrogen with low carbon hydrogen as feedstock, but also considering that decarbonization options are quite limited for a number of processes, in particular high heat processes. So it's really hard to get to certain temperature levels via electricity. And this is where hydrogen may be able to play a role. One thing we're flagging is that where you will often see in the debate that this appears like a relatively obvious role in terms of technical capability, there are very strong reliability requirements on the part of customers, which means that we actually may not see this as happening just now, because a track record of reliability will be required before industrial players can make the switch. Also, as ever, alternative options will drive the extent to which hydrogen does play a significant role. And on this segment, we see that it's mostly the feasibility of post-combustion carbon capture as the alternative for hard to decarbonize cases. Then the second sector that is getting significant attention is mobility. In particular, decarbonization options for heavy transport are quite limited, and this is where we see again a strong potential for hydrogen to play a role. Now, given fuel cell electric vehicles remain very expensive, require extensive fueling infrastructure, it is expected that public transport may be the first mover, because you can organize that in between depots where refueling infrastructure can be installed and sort of supplied without a network. I mean, maybe worth flagging here, we didn't include a plane, we didn't include a ship, but there is also a possibility that by transport, we also see maritime and aviation uses develop for hydrogen carriers. Third, in relation to heating in buildings, in Europe, mostly electrification and district heat are expected to compete for building heat. In particular, because relative to electricity, there's quite a bit of complexity around transitioning to hydrogen for heat, given network and in-house appliance conversion requirements. However, it is the case that in some places electrification may not be feasible, and therefore hydrogen may play a part, including in setups where it could help address the peakiness of electricity demand when a large share of heating is electrified. So one solution for this, for instance, considered here is a hybrid heat pumps that effectively can function on electric power at times and then on hydrogen at other times, in order to avoid some large peaks. And finally, in terms of use cases at the 2050 horizon, renewables is a sort of main focus for decarbonization, decarbonizing, sorry, the production of power. However, there are limitations in relation to storage of energy, of electric energy, and therefore hydrogen is being considered, not least because there are options to repurpose existing gas storage facilities, in particular saline cavities. And there may also be a case for using hydrogen directly as a substitute for natural gas in CCGT. So this is, all of these mays effectively drive the uncertainty that we're facing. As we're flagging it in the short term, some countries have chosen to explore blending in methane-based pipes, as this effectively gives you a source of demand that can be there to support the deployment of production facilities, including on an experimental basis, and ensure that there's an outlet for the output as we wait to see exactly which sectors do make the conversion to hydrogen. In order to explain a little bit the uncertainty, obviously we've talked about some of the feasibility questions and what the alternatives are. There's clearly a competitiveness question at play here as well. With this graph, we try and illustrate that hydrogen is an expensive abatement option. You know, of the various use cases we've considered, it is very rarely the case that hydrogen comes out as the most economic option, and it comes with a lot of uncertainty still today, hence the experimental phase in order to try and reduce costs down significantly. But it remains the case that it could help to tackle quite hard to decarbonize use cases. And I think we expect in the end policy, at least in the first instance, to focus on those cases where it's got a somewhat unique role to play in the in terms of the types of use cases that it decarbonizes. Turning to a more political debate, in addition to some uncertainty around demand, Europe currently is sort of having a bit of a debate on the supply side, which we tend to call a debate on the acceptable colors of hydrogen. As you may hear in various publications around hydrogen, whilst we're starting mainly from grey hydrogen produced from natural gas, a number of technical options are being investigated in order to produce renewable or low carbon hydrogen, that is to say with a lower emissions sort of net effect. In particular, we tend to hear a lot about blue hydrogen, still produced from natural gas, but with carbon capture at the end of the process, as opposed to green hydrogen, which would be produced by electrolysis from renewable electricity, for instance, directly from wind or PV farms. This is only a subset of the rainbow that's being considered. So as you will see here, there is at the moment a bit of uncertainty as to how turquoise hydrogen, and based on the pyrolysis technology, will develop. But there's also a lot of uncertainty on how nuclear, so the hydrogen produced by electrolysis, but from nuclear, will be considered in terms of its clean characteristics and therefore its acceptability as part of decarbonizing the hydrogen input. So sort of to recap effectively on that side, the technologies, they all differ in the level of competitiveness, and obviously that those differences in costs levels conflate with the differences in terms of the cost of adapting at the end use level. But in addition to that, the debate is also quite largely political in terms of which would be the acceptable sources of hydrogen. And maybe finally, so far, given a relatively domestic view of the hydrogen question. However, it is the case that imports are expected to be an important supply option. I mentioned earlier that Germany is of the view that it will definitely need to import hydrogen, given the volume of demand and the share of its economy that it's hoping to decarbonize via hydrogen. It may be the case in other European countries. And we did a bit of work for the World Energy Council, looking at what would be the potential for a world market for hydrogen, first built for clean hydrogen, first building on an assessment of potential for producer countries. And in the left-hand side here, you see a map of countries with very high res potential, as well as a good sort of political stability and other factors that could support the establishment of the first step of a global value chain. Worth flagging, as explained on the right-hand side, that in those cases, when we say hydrogen, we actually mean hydrogen in a number of forms, given that it is not most efficient to transport hydrogen along long distances in gaseous forms, and therefore the work and the thinking here in terms of how to integrate Europe's ambitions for hydrogen within a global market include relying on transportation in the form of ammonia, where hydrogen is converted to ammonia, shipped and then reconverted, which is a sort of well-established technique. Another option is synthetic methane, which allows shipping at minus 163 Celsius before regasifying, which appears as possibly sort of more feasible than liquid hydrogen, which, as you will see on this slide, requires liquefaction at minus 253 Celsius. That's starting to be more difficult. Apologies that we did not transpose these into Fahrenheit, and I cannot do this live, but I think the relativities speak for themselves. And then finally, fourth option is liquid organic hydrogen carriers, where you effectively sort of stick the hydrogen onto another carrier in order to ship it at a manageable temperature of 20 Celsius, and then reconvert it to hydrogen. I hope this sets the scene for what comes next, which is how do we make all of this happen? And I will leave the floor to Claire to portray the thinking and the decision making that's been taking place in this space.
Thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for taking over on the slides when my internet failed. Hopefully that is all sorted now. So just before, I'm going to talk about how various European governments are trying to enable the hydrogen market. And just going to start with a slide on the context. So before we get to the kind of detailed policy instruments that people are thinking about, it's worth just thinking about where we are in terms of our move to a net zero economy that involves hydrogen. So I think there is agreement that the ultimate destination is a net zero economy, and that ultimately we'd like that to be subsidy free and for market signals to be working really well. But there's also recognition that we're really far away from that at present. So in the near term, we're talking about first of a kind investments in immature technologies. The markets are small or maybe don't even exist yet. And there's a really high degree of policy risk and policy intervention right across the value chain. So that's the context that the policies that I'm going to talk about are being developed in. It's also worth saying that people do have an eye to the medium term, and this is where the medium term is where we would expect to see more market signals being introduced, and definitely more emphasis on getting cross-sectoral efficiency. But at present, the focus is really getting those first investments off the ground, and everything I talk about in the next few slides is in that context. So what are the problems that policymakers are trying to solve? So this slide just shows a very simple representation of the low carbon hydrogen value chain. On the left-hand side, we have production and imports. And on the right-hand side, we have some of the demand sectors that Catherine mentioned. And in the middle, we've got hydrogen transport and storage, which Dan will talk about in due course. So to start on the left-hand side, there is a series of policy problems and barriers to do with production that are really quite familiar with policymakers from the experience with renewable electricity. So what we have is a set of production technologies that aren't receiving full compensation for the positive externalities they create or the negative externalities that they avoid. And as Catherine showed, those production technologies are at different levels of maturity and have very different costs at present, although we don't really know what their future cost relativity is likely to be. We also have, on the import side, there isn't yet a kind of fully up and running certification system that would allow different countries to know the carbon intensity of the or the greenness of the hydrogen that they're importing. So there's a set of issues there that need to be solved, and those are really quite familiar from the renewable electricity world. But moving to the right-hand side of the slide, thank you, Catherine. Once we start thinking about what the demand sectors are actually going to do with those low carbon hydrogen, we bring in a set of new problems. And really the key issue is that hydrogen is not a direct substitute for the incumbent fuels. And this means that in order to demand hydrogen, each of those a set of new investments needs to be made on the demand side, for example, in new kit in industry, or new refueling infrastructure and vehicles on the transport side. Those investments have to be made in the expectation that investment will also happen on the production side. And vice versa, the producers need to invest in expectation that investments that will enable the use of the fuel will happen on the demand side. So there's a really big chicken and egg problem that goes far beyond anything we saw in the renewable electricity world. And that chicken and egg problem is made more acute because of the importance of policy in driving both production and demand. So there is, low carbon hydrogen is certainly more expensive than the incumbent fuels at present. And that means that none of this is going to happen without some sort of policy intervention. And we know that, of course, it's very difficult for investors to manage policy risk efficiently. So these are all the kinds of issues that policymakers are trying to tackle. Great, so on the next slide, how are they going to tackle these? Well, the short answer is there is no consensus at present. And on this slide, we've got a few examples from how various people are tackling these issues across Europe. And what we'll show is not only are there different examples or instruments being used in different countries, there's actually different instruments being used for different sectors within the same country as well. So this slide shows 4 different groups of instruments, and these are the types of instruments we've tended to look at when analysing this for governments and investors. So we've got carbon prices, subsidies to producers, subsidies to end users, and obligations. So to start off with the carbon price, as I mentioned before, there's real recognition that this is where we want to be going in the long term. But in the near term, it's mainly seen as a complement to the more targeted measures. And that's for 2 reasons. One is the level of the carbon price that would be required to bring on those first of a kind low carbon hydrogen investments would really be quite high. And introducing such a high carbon price would have big distributional consequences. The other issue with the carbon price is that it's very difficult to give investors the sort of long-term certainty that they would like when making these decisions to get into low carbon hydrogen. So we've seen in the past with taxes, governments step in and adjust them, and there's also uncertainty around the parameters of trading schemes and what that means for the long-term carbon price. So the carbon price is certainly a complement to the more targeted measures and helps differentiate between different hydrogen production types that have different carbon intensities, but it's not going to be enough on its own in the near term. So the next type of measure is a production subsidy. So with the production subsidy, you could imagine producers receiving a payment that allows them to sell the low carbon hydrogen at a price that competes with the incumbent fossil fuel. And this has a few advantages. So one advantage is that it allows in the near term different differential subsidies to be given to different technologies. So this means that given we don't know in the long term really which low carbon hydrogen production technology will be cheaper. So it might be a good idea to have a few different options on the system, and subsidizing producers instead of end users allows you to give lower subsidies to those technologies that are cheaper at present. The other advantage of a production subsidy is that it can help manage demand risk. So if the sectors that are being targeted in the near term are very risky sectors, so for example, an industrial sector that might be prone to offshoring or going out of business, it could be difficult to get large-scale investment in low-carbon hydrogen production up and running without transferring some of that demand risk away from investors. And we've seen this kind of rationale has been taken up in the UK, and we expect the UK to announce at some point over the summer a producer subsidy, and it's likely to be a revenue stabilization instrument. So a bit like the contracts for differences that we see in renewable electricity in the UK. Another type of instrument that's been introduced on the production side is in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands has introduced a carbon CFD scheme, and that is aimed at covering the costs of CCS for blue hydrogen as well. And I should have mentioned also the UK focus is certainly on blue hydrogen for industry. That's what we're expecting to see in the hydrogen strategy that comes out. But other countries are focusing more on end user subsidies, and there are some advantages to end user subsidies as well. So particularly where there's quite a lot of diversity in the incumbent fuels and in the costs to the end users of switching over to the low carbon hydrogen. So for example, if you have a series of different, if you're trying to incentivize people to switch from grey hydrogen, from diesel and from natural gas all at once, they will require different levels of subsidies to kind of equalize the cost of their fuel. And that is easier to do with an end user subsidy than a production subsidy. And we've seen that Germany is going down this route and is introducing a pilot carbon CFD aimed at the steel and chemical industries. And also, as Catherine mentioned, hot off the press, we're seeing that the EU is planning to give free EU ETS allowances to electrolyzers, which is another way of subsidizing production. So the final set of instruments are obligations. So what we mean by this is where consumers or suppliers are required to submit some certificates covering part of their fuel consumption or supply, demonstrating that this portion is low carbon. The downside of obligations in this space, in the context of the big chicken and egg problem, is that they're again quite prone to tweaking by governments over time. So they're not necessarily well set up to manage some of the policy risk that investors in production and demand are facing. However, we are seeing them in place. So the UK has just announced yesterday changes to its renewables fuels transport obligation that will better enable the use of green hydrogen projects in the transport sector. And Germany has also got quotas on e-fuels in aviation. So really the conclusion is there isn't yet a consensus on how best to overcome these multiple barriers. And not only are there differences across countries, there's also differences within countries. So on the next slide, the final piece of the jigsaw is the important projects of common interest framework. So this is an EU state aid framework that allows member states to finance investment in low carbon hydrogen. So there's a specific IPCEI low carbon hydrogen pot. And there has been a really high level of interest in this. So the way it works is that national governments come up with a short list of projects that they would like to submit into this scheme. And then there's a process of matchmaking whereby projects in different member states seek out collaborators in other member states. Because one of the conditions of IPCEI funding is that more than one member state is involved in each project. And at present, we're in the matchmaking phase. So as of June, 434 projects had gone into this phase. And these span lots of different parts of the hydrogen value chain. So there's green and blue hydrogen production, there's networks, and there's networks and storage and other kind of associated hydrogen related services. And just to give you an example of the scale of these projects, so Germany has put in 61 projects, and these projects alone would receive 8 billion euro of German funding, of funding from the German government, and about 33 billion euros from the private sector. So we're really talking about projects at a large scale as part of this scheme. So at that, I will hand over to Dan to talk to the next section.
Thanks, Claire. So in this final section, before we draw some conclusions, we're going to talk about natural gas infrastructure. So the transport infrastructure, clearly, whether we're talking about the EU or the US, is transporting an immense amount of final energy demand to the economies. And it's also configured in such a way as that it's able to help meet seasonality in energy demand where heating or cooling is an issue. So it's got lots of seasonal storage, which means that we don't need so much peak infrastructure. Now, the issue is with the drive to net zero and decarbonisation that the continued use in an unabated sense of that natural gas infrastructure isn't possible in a way which is consistent with those targets. So you face the choice of either decommissioning a lot of existing infrastructure before the end of its useful economic life, and that brings with it lots of commercial questions for the owners of that network and storage infrastructure, or repurposing it to use hydrogen to transport gaseous hydrogen to meet elements of final energy demand that Catherine was talking about, and indeed to use hydrogen potentially as a storage medium to help store energy to iron out seasonality in our consumption. So for those various reasons, gas transmission and distribution companies and indeed storage operators have been very keen to follow the hydrogen story. And on the next slide, we see their first thoughts in this area. The transmission companies in Europe have developed a vision of what a hydrogen grid or hydrogen backbone, as they call it, might look like, and you see it evolving over time in these three panels. So it starts out at an early stage on the left, essentially around industrial clusters. So as Catherine was talking about, serving, transporting hydrogen from production sites to industrial customers, perhaps some urban conurbations for transport uses, and maybe providing a degree of resilience between those industrial clusters so the industries aren't reliant on one sole hydrogen production source. It then, in the middle panel, starts to do more of the same, but also link up new, to a greater extent, areas of Europe which are renewables rich. So in particular, the south and the north, where, and therefore allowing, if you like, more access to green hydrogen production sources to ship the energy to the increasing uses. And then finally, in the third panel, you see again ongoing development of the EU-wide infrastructure, but also linking up with North Africa, where in particular the German government's investing a lot of time and effort in diplomatic moves to try and prepare the ground for green hydrogen production, and the Northwest and the British Isles, which have a lot of wind resource, and indeed general port infrastructure on the western coast of Europe for imports of gaseous LNG, liquefied hydrogen, or ammonia, or liquid organic hydrogen compounds. But at the moment, the network company's vision is really just that. It's a bit of a vision, and there's a debate going on as to whether if you like, it's a case of if we build it, they will come. We should build the network infrastructure out, and that will increase the confidence of industrial companies to convert to their high heat processes to hydrogen. It will increase the confidence of producers to invest in hydrogen production, so that because they know they'll have more of a ready market. Or whether we should, if you like, let the supply and demand side of the market lead. So let customers convert, let producers start to manufacture, and then gradually link those up with the network over time. And there's a third angle to this, which is for any national jurisdiction, there's also a bit of a recognition not every jurisdiction will be self-sufficient given its renewable resource availability. So there's a question about should already countries start building network to prepare for the fact that they will have to import at some point in time. On the next slide, I think our kind of our view on this is anything beyond a very simple backbone development at this stage probably puts the cart before the horse a little bit, because in reality where you end up is given the uncertainty of demand, of the extent of demand for hydrogen that Catherine was talking about, where you end up on infrastructure really is equally uncertain. So if you end up in a world of clusters on the left-hand side, where, if you like, the principal uses of hydrogen are the least with regrets ones that we see at the moment in industry and heavy transport, you're probably more interested in just having point-to-point hydrogen transport infrastructure. That'll provide resilience to your clusters. If your clusters have different profiles of demand, different profiles of production, it'll allow for some trading and maybe for some international transit. But you're not, it's not obvious that you'll need very highly developed distribution networks in the sense of urban distribution networks and lower pressure distribution networks for the hydrogen uses that you see on the left. In the middle, maybe you end up in a more regional construct where you have some clusters, but if you like, have a halo around those clusters where hydrogen is able to be economically and sensibly put to other uses. So maybe in those halos, maybe there's more building use of hydrogen for heat, or maybe there's more use of hydrogen in the power sector. And there, your hydrogen network requirements are still going to be quite limited. They're still going to be geographically specific, but you may have a use for more lower pressure meshed distribution. And in contrast, if you're on the right, and hydrogen does prove to be more of a silver bullet and is used pretty ubiquitously in the same way that natural gas is currently, then clearly you'll need a similar set of network infrastructure. And I think the takeaway from this is actually, given that we don't know, and in particular some of the uses of hydrogen that are expressed at the moment are very uncertain, actually the outlook for the transport and the distribution infrastructure is very uncertain, and it's probably a bit too early to be planning specific network designs and specific network rollouts before we really get a true understanding of what the demand and supply outlook looks like. On the next slide, I think you can see what that then looks like over time. So if in the longer term, the answer is it depends, we might need a little, we might need a lot. In the short term, I think it is more clear that we probably don't need much hydrogen network infrastructure rolled out, because we would foresee, and indeed if you look at all of the lots of the hydrogen projects around Europe, you will see that they are often dedicated production to a consumption, often co-located production on a consumption site, and you may get a short bit of infrastructure between the producer and the consumer, but you're not seeing a mass need for either conversion or new investment in hydrogen transmission infrastructure. That, however, doesn't mean that you can forget policy and regulation of infrastructure completely. So on the next slide, we present a little bit of a roadmap as to our view of how the regulatory arrangements around the network infrastructure may have to develop over time. So in the short term, there's probably two key things you need to do. If you have this vision in your mind of dedicated pipelines for industrial clusters, that works well for the first investments on those clusters. But then when a new customer comes along who'd like to connect, or a new producer establishes themselves in that region, what you'd want as a policymaker, and what society wants, is them to be able to share network infrastructure if it's physically possible, because that's going to be the lowest overall cost outcome. So since the government is in one way or another going to be subsidizing these early investments, you'd ideally want conditions of those subsidies which, if you like, tell the investors that they should prepare to share the infrastructure if that becomes pertinent and if it's physically possible in due course. And if that's going to give those investors a revenue upside because they're getting third-party access fees from other users, then as the public subsidizer, you might also want to share in some of that revenue upside. So there's a whole sort of the key bit of regulation in that sense early on is making sure that, if you like, there's no foreclosure to the hydrogen network infrastructure that's being converted or built, and the efficient development of shared infrastructure can happen down the track. There's a second thing you're going to need to do, which is beginning the process of coordination across the energy system. The infrastructure takes time to develop and plan, and all of the options, uncertain as they are, but the options for hydrogen network infrastructure multiply up the decisions that are needed relative to history. So in these first investments, there's a first question of, should we build the infrastructure that bit bigger on the assumption that there will be sharing down the track? Open question. There's a question of, should we be transporting electricity and making hydrogen near demand, or should we be making the hydrogen near where we produce the electricity and transporting the gas? If we're going to be using hydrogen in transport, what does that mean for the location of hydrogen production and network, given that there's probably a lot of fueling stations which haven't had high pressure gas pipes linked up to them to date? So there's a lot of inter-fuel optimization decisions that are going to need to go on to make sure this happens at the lowest cost. And historically, investments have kind of been planned in a silo. So the electricity guys planned the electricity network, the gas guys planned the gas network, and there was a limited need for them to talk to each other and optimize their networks and the new investments they undertook between themselves. And the regulatory arrangements didn't necessarily make it such that they had incentives to say if the gas guys to say to the electricity guys, no, go, you build this one. So there's probably a need to put in place some regulatory and institutional arrangements, not so that the decisions are made, but so that the planning and the optimization can start to take place when it becomes clearer what network is required. And then finally, that's the near term. Finally, as it becomes clearer over the medium term whether we do or not need significant network infrastructure, and whether we do have new monopoly networks in hydrogen transmission and distribution, then we're going to need to think about the regulatory arrangements that go with that at that point in time. But the regulatory arrangements are going to have to be a little bit more nuanced than those probably that we have in gas and electricity to date. So they're going to have to allow the question of conversions to be addressed. So we're going to convert bits of old gas grid maybe into hydrogen grid, because that's better than building new dedicated hydrogen pipelines. Well, if that's the right decision for society, we've got to work out how we can check that the gas infrastructure is going to still keep delivering gas in the meantime, albeit on lower and lower volumes when we take bits of it out to help with hydrogen. And B, the hydrogen, the gas network operators are going to want to be to have a financial payout if their network is now being taken off them or being used in a different part of their regulation to transport hydrogen. Network and storage as regulation is going to look different, and storage regulation in particular may need to look different than that for gas, because with hydrogen there are many different ways you can store the product than with gas. You can store it in ammonia, you can store it in liquid compounds. With network, you've got questions around if we're using it in refueling, are we trucking it, and therefore is the network really a natural monopoly? Does it face competition? So there's a lot more nuances that regulation is going to have to deal with than with the old monopoly electricity and gas networks. And probably the last and most important one is who pays. So again, historically, this has pretty much been a siloed operation. If I'm an electricity customer, I pay for the electricity network. If I'm a gas customer, I pay for the gas network. If we charge hydrogen customers for a new and expanding hydrogen network, there's at least a risk that the price that we end up charging the first hydrogen customers onto that network is going to be so big that it's going to discourage them from uptaking the hydrogen, because we're not spreading the costs of a network over a lot of users. So it may be that we're either going to have to invent forms of regulation which back end the recovery of costs and allow tariffs to rise over time, or we're going to have to break down some of the vertical silos and admit that well, maybe to the extent that hydrogen infrastructure is helping support managing flexibility on the power network, or to the extent that hydrogen infrastructure is substituting for some gas consumption, maybe we need to move to a situation where some of the gas or electricity users are actually also contributing to the hydrogen costs. There's a lot of political sensitivity and a lot of debate in sorting all of that out, but it's probably one of the more important areas that network regulation is going to have to deal with in this medium term phase. We then move to maybe to make some conclusions on what if you like our takeaways would be for the US debate from what's happened in Europe. I guess break this into three. First off, let's look at what's worked. So what's worked in Europe is there is a huge level of interest. The EU's ambition and a very large centralized pot of funding has been successful in catalyzing amazing interest from developers. There's a database of hydrogen projects in Europe that's hundreds long, and it's very difficult to read an industry journal in Europe without seeing the word hydrogen very early on. So that whole process has been very successful in catalyzing developer interest in the sector, both from customers and producers. The way the public authorities have presented the argument has also been successful in breaking down silos. So for a long time, the words sector coupling have been in vogue in Europe, and there's a recognition that hydrogen isn't an electricity thing, it isn't a gas thing, it isn't a transport thing. It's actually a fuel which cuts across all of those sectors, and there is an understanding or an agreement and a way that the debate is framed which kind of recognizes that, albeit that I think that a lot of people would also admit that we don't exactly know how to manage it yet, but the debate has been very successful in setting out in that direction rather than siloizing the issues. There isn't yet a consensus on all of the required policy instruments, but I think what you can see from Europe and what may be helpful to take away into the US is some common views. So there is, I think, a general recognition that low carbon hydrogen is a lot more complicated than renewable electricity. You can't just think about how you're going to produce it and then get going, because outside of the small number, the low volume of grey hydrogen use that there is out there, there is not a market for low carbon hydrogen. So in contrast to renewable electricity, I think there is a strong consensus that you need action on the producer and the consumer side, and there needs to be a lot more government intervention to get it going. The whole thing then breaks down into lots of arguments about which policy instrument would be best and which country is going to go for which. But I think at that fundamental level, there's some agreement. There's also there's also a degree of consensus that cost reductions are needed. Costs of green hydrogen are way too high at the moment to make it credible for use at scale in Europe. There's a little bit less consensus about how you get those costs down. You'll get some people who say, simple, the way we did it in electricity, we just build our way through the problem. So if we roll this out at scale, the cost will come down. And there are others that said we tried that in electricity and it was damn expensive. What we should do is we should focus on R&D, and we should get scale demonstrators going, and that will teach us, if you like, where the cost reductions are. And this whole area is complicated by the fact that a large chunk of the costs of green hydrogen are indeed renewable electricity installations. A lot of the cost curve we've seen come down there, so we're probably past the key cost reduction phase there. And then finally, I think there's a bit of a recognition that what you do with the network will need to follow the demand and supply, and that regulation like that in gas is probably going to be important at some point. There's less of a consensus about, as I was saying, if you like, whether you adopt a "we will build it and they will come" mentality, or whether that risks creating a lot of stranded costs in the network sector. And there's equally a little bit of debate about whether you should just roll out gas-type monopoly network regulation now, or whether you should wait and do something a bit more fit for purpose. But there is some consensus that sort of whatever is done in this area, it will need to be flexible to the way in which the hydrogen market eventually develops, and an acknowledgement that the uncertainty there is too great to fully nail this debate as it stands. And then finally, one thing we've kind of done wrong, which maybe you can learn from. There has been an awful amount of internecine fighting amongst people who love hydrogen. So there is a lot of debates about what hydrogen can do. It can either just reach the parts that electricity cannot reach, or it can do industry, heating, power generation, maybe do the dishes after dinner as well. There's an awful lot of arguments that, if you like, go nowhere, because the answer is no one knows. There's also a lot of arguments about the different forms of production of hydrogen, and whether blue is better, whether green is better, whether blue can act as a bridge, whether green is everything we should be targeting. And I guess with a bit of luck, European policy will start to focus a bit more specifically on where the areas of least regret are. So there are some things that we can do of least regret, delivering probably a mixture of green and blue hydrogen to some areas of industry and some areas of transport, to just get stuff moving and start the market being catalyzed. And there are probably a whole raft of other things we should do in an experimentation and innovation sense to try and resolve some of the arguments by study that go on amongst the different contingencies about what hydrogen can do. So hopefully policy will gradually start to crystallize around banking some early wins and trying to resolve some of the debates by real experimentation. But I think that the takeaway that more and more studies on costs and what it could do one day don't take you that far is probably an important lesson to learn. And with that, and also with an eye on the time, we'll wind up and I guess hand over to maybe some questions and answers.
Thank you, Dan. I was chatting with some of our attendees, and I suggested we'd stay on for at least another 5 minutes to maybe have some short Q&A, if that works with the panel. And then we can wrap up, maybe even longer if there's still an interest in questions. As Alex had told us earlier on at the beginning, if you have questions, if you can put them in the Q&A text box, I'll be monitoring those and trying to bring them up. But I thought I would start off just very quickly. One of the themes that I'm hearing today from our conversation is coordination and timing. And I don't mean just timing intertemporally, but I think it's really timing and being able to be somewhat nimble with infrastructure that takes billions of dollars in investments, but nimble to address how the uncertainties may evolve and change, nimble to address the geographical scope. It sounds like we'll, in the EU, they're starting with clusters and then going to potentially more geographically diverse focus across the entire EU. And that may be the way to go in the US as well, and in other parts of the world. How do you see some of the policy or support initiatives working out to help address some of that coordination and timing? Because it seems so critical to getting it right. It's the idea that I don't know, we don't want we were always worried about windmills that would be built before the transmission to take the wind out of markets, and some countries actually had that happen to them. We've seen the issues of coordination between two different systems here in the US recently. In February, Storm Uri really pointed out some of the fatal flaws between our electric and gas system coordinating holes. So what do we do in the industry and as policymakers to make sure that we can at least line things up a bit to progress the hydrogen economy?
It's a great question, and it really gets to the heart of what policymakers are trying to grapple with at the moment. And I think, as we've said, it's hard to see you know, a sole focus on production or a sole focus on end users doing the job. Even if in the UK, for example, we end up going for mainly focusing on production subsidies, you could imagine that also need some consumer subsidies just to pay for some of the upfront costs of the switching kit. One thing I didn't mention going through the slides was around blending, and blending can help with this. So if you are putting, say, up to 20% by volume of hydrogen into the grid, you don't tend to need many demand side investments. And certainly in the UK context, that isn't seen as a kind of long-term solution because it saves only a little bit of carbon, but it's seen as sort of an interim measure that can help you get your production side up and running and slowly increase your demand side, and therefore kind of eat into the chicken and egg problem a little bit. But yeah, that question of getting production and demand up at the same time really requires more than one policy instrument.
I think the other thing to note on that is that's complicated when you're doing it within one country. Some of the, you know, Europe recognizes that it's not going to be self-sufficient in hydrogen, and there are all sorts of diplomatic maneuvers going on in North Africa, as I mentioned, in the Middle East, in some of the Russian, the former Soviet republics, where there seemed to be a lot of space and a lot of renewable resource for the manufacture of green hydrogen. I mean, the complexity obviously just starts to multiply manyfold when you start to think about that. And you know, that those projects are clearly not going to be, it's going to be very tricky to align those sort of all down a complete value chain so that there's customers lined up for those projects when the hydrogen starts to be produced. So you're into a world where you have to sort of almost presume that you have found enough customers and presume that the hydrogen development on the customer side is far enough along, and then those projects will come on stream to make the whole thing cheaper once that growth is kind of locked in. But it's a pretty long-term bet.
And we actually had a question that sort of relates to this, Dan, with respect to and it's to better understand, I think, the EU situation in some ways so we can apply it to North America and Canada. So North America, US and Canada, which is the whole idea of kind of the infrastructure. And I know you told us, don't worry about the infrastructure yet. That's a longer term problem. But in that vision you showed us on the map of the European continent, of the network, are some of those components really just conversion of existing infrastructure? And is EU actually moving in any way to try to negotiate that the transnational infrastructure build out of new infrastructure that might be necessary? And what has actually worked? Because I think the question really talks about the fact that large scale infrastructure like this crossing jurisdictions has always been a problem here in the US and in Canada. And so we'd love to know what EU is doing to try to support that.
Yeah, so that vision is a bit of both. If you stared very closely at those maps, you would see that actually there's a color coding on them. Some of it is converting of existing gas lines where there are parallel lines, so you can take a gas line out without impacting the gas supply that it's carrying, and some of them are new lines. And obviously, that speaks to all of the regulatory questions, which haven't really yet been solved, because you don't need to start doing that, but get convincing your gas network operator that either it's okay, hand it over to this other guy, or tell you what, take it out one rate base and put it in another rate base, is going to need some working through before everyone's happy with it. On the international side of things, the EU has not yet managed to do this on renewable electricity. So it has for a long time been possible for a country to subsidize a renewable scheme in another country and for that to count towards its renewables quotas. Very little of it happens because, funny enough, taking your customers' money and shipping it to another country where you fund investments proves to be not always a vote winner amongst your domestic constituencies. So, but whereas there have been fights for 10, 20 years on that front in electricity, actually the member states have kind of almost, particularly sort of, a lot of the big member states, so Germany for one, which hated the idea of spending money outside Germany on renewable electricity, has been one of the first to say, we're going to need to do some of this extra jurisdictionally. So we're going to need to spend money in other jurisdictions. So maybe, just maybe, that realization is going to start the debate off in a different place. The other thing, and this comes back a little bit to what I was saying about institution building and regulation building, there are two Europe-wide transmission organizations. So they have the snappy title ENTSO-E and ENTSO-G for electricity and gas, and they are in charge of Europe-wide network planning, and there is a European-wide electricity network development plan and gas network development plan funded by the states, but at least someone is at the European level doing the planning. And they have been gradually coming closer together, and the advent of hydrogen is pushing them closer and closer together. They're developing integrated planning tools, they're developing scenarios, and then thinking about how their networks could be better optimized. Is it perfect yet? Obviously not. But I think that's a good example of the sort of institution building and regulation building that actually you probably need to start doing now, because we all know it takes a long time to get that up and running.
Thank you. One of the questions I'm also seeing right now in the chat box, it's talking a little bit about policies. There was a comment made that in the US, a very common policy we've used in the electricity sector on the renewable front, and that's probably going to be deployed for the carbon economy as well, is the tax credit incentives that are handed out in order to facilitate financing costs of new investments. It does sound from the discussion of the use cases as well as policies by Catherine and Claire that, in fact, it's a bit of a different approach in the EU. Would you be able to maybe give us a little bit more comment on what you've seen to date, that low-hanging fruit in terms of practicality and effectiveness for policies? Is it been more focused on particular use cases? We saw the country by country discussion, but from the early tell signs of those policies, where has there been a lot of movement to ramp up the hydrogen economy?
Great. Yeah, another really interesting question. And I think it's fair to say that none of these policies are really tried and tested yet. So people are still at the design and piloting phase rather than having really pushed them out. And I think really the kind of producer incentive via tax credits would work best in a world where you're really concerned about managing the demand risk that producers face, and also in a world where there isn't a huge amount of diversity in the potential uses for the low carbon hydrogen. So say, for example, you're starting off by focusing on heavy industry that currently uses natural gas or something like that. So that then makes the production instrument quite a good targeted measure. Then if you were in a world where you had a lot of diversity in the different uses, you might potentially want to go down the end user subsidy route, as they've done in Germany. But really there's pros and cons to both. And I think, we advise the UK government towards a producer subsidy in the UK context. And that was really because of the focus on industry and because of what stakeholders described to us as a kind of existential risk around the demand, that they just couldn't make an investment in low carbon hydrogen production, given a lot of the potential demand for their product was policy driven and also not very certain over any kind of useful timescale.
It comes back to the difference between one of the important differences between hydrogen and renewable electricity. If you're always guaranteed a market for renewable electricity and you can get yourself some tax credits by putting up a wind farm, then that's if the incentive is strong enough, that's an easy sell to your board, I guess. If on the other hand, if there's no market for the thing that you might be producing, then the incentive that you're going to need to produce it against, like Claire says, that kind of, this isn't a will I get the right price, this is a there's no one to take this stuff once I've made it question. It's a slightly different question, and it needs maybe a different subsidy answer.
And I think this probably explains why we're expecting the policy design to really go in two phases. And in the early phase where there isn't a market, it's likely to be nearly ad hoc policy support given in the form of grants that directly fund the cost of specific projects, including with quite significant sort of investment aid, which was something that was not really seen as either virtuous or even allowed under legacy state aid guidelines in Europe. But these are being revisited, and there's a door has been opened to really increase the percentage of investments of capital expenditure that can be funded, and this would enable, effectively subject to quite close analysis of costs by policymakers, to just fund those projects nearly entirely when they get built, because the idea that is underpinning all of the other tools, whereby you smear the subsidy across the lifetime of the project, doesn't quite work if you're not sure about the lifetime of the project, because you're not sure about the lifetime of its demand.
Different beast, and it requires a different war plan, right? So I will throw out one more question that came up in our Q&A from one of our attendees. And it's a question about hydrogen storage. In part, I think this may be coming out because of issues we've seen, very different regional issues we've seen across the US and Canada about where we can store gas, salt caverns, depleted oil gas operations, and the need for storage of every type. That is a hot topic in the electricity sector. Are there viable options for hydrogen storage in Europe? And that's the question.
Yes, thank you. So there are likely to be some options, exactly which is still sort of the object of some significant work programs. Effectively, where the sector's got to is first start small. The first option is on-site sort of storage at small scale. This is one of the alternatives, which sort of matches the fact that you may have rather decentralized production relative to, say, natural gas. Then there's the question of shared storage with relatively large installations. The consensus for now seems to be that salt caverns, sorry, that was lost in translation, salt caverns will be easily, she says, will be convertible to hydrogen, and whereas the jury is still out on aquifers, so different types of cavities, and equally the expectation that there could be new sites which were not suitable for natural gas underground storage that could be suitable for hydrogen underground storage. Of the work we've done, we've seen that obviously there is uncertainty and therefore quite a lot of funding from a sort of an R&D perspective required in order to further investigate this. And there's also a bit of a technical / market question, which is how do you manage the conversion, in that if you assume that there could be a time where there is an element of parallel sort of hydrogen and natural gas sectors, at least as part of the transition, there is a question, given that these cavities tend to be quite large, whether you blend into them and then you de-blend and effectively share some of the existing storage between natural gas and hydrogen, or whether you have to decide on the given date to fully convert, which may or may not be feasible given the amount of natural gas that is in any underground gas storage facility at any given point in time. Sort of removing it entirely and then replacing that might create some feasibility. So this is still a big question mark, largely technical for now, and probably a regulatory design one a bit later on once we know what the options are in more detail.
And one other sort of thing, which sort of the gas storage company or the traditional gas storage companies probably are always a wee bit less keen to talk about, is that one of the things with low carbon hydrogen is you can store it in different forms. So we talk about transporting low carbon hydrogen as ammonia in a liquid organic compound, and therefore just as easily you've got a conversion efficiency loss, clearly, but it is technically possible to store it in these different means. So you've probably got a world where, as Catherine described, you've got sort of small local storage, which is almost inevitably going to be needed for industrial customers to convince them that the system is resilient enough early on. You've got bigger gas storage sites. You've maybe got alternative new forms of storage. So you've actually potentially got a sort of significantly more diverse energy storage landscape with low carbon hydrogen and its associated sort of forms than you had with natural gas.
Well, this has been a wonderful. I know that there's an amazing group of attendees here. Over 40 of you guys have stuck around well past our 11 a.m. Official end time. And I'm sure we could continue talking about this for hours longer. And in fact, that's what I wanted to let you know about. So we will be continuing today's conversation about the role of hydrogen, policies, regulations, investments in the future. In fact, I think we're scheduled to hold a follow-up webinar in September, where we envision discussing and leveraging some of the insights that Dan, Catherine, and Claire have provided us today about the European experience, but start to consider how we apply some of those policies and initiatives in the US and Canada. So please stay tuned. Have a wonderful summer, and we hope to see you back in September for that. And in answer to a question I think we had earlier, when we post the slide deck, we will include contact information. I think that was an early question. So please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us with further questions. We're just so sorry that we couldn't do more this morning. Alex, back to you then.
Great. Thank you, Julia, and thank you to the whole London Economics and Frontier Economics teams for taking the time to present today. As Julia mentioned, contact info will be posted on our website, in addition to the slides and the webinar of today's recording, or sorry, the recording of today's webinar. I have included the link in the chat box there. Again, thank you everyone for joining us today, and we hope you have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you in September. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.